Hello, and welcome to our second session on the virtues. Today we'll take a look at the cardinal or human virtues, the more human part of the 7 virtues that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks. It's a beautiful day today, so I decided that it was prudent and just of me to be out here to introduce the session with the trees in the background. Prudence? Justice? Are there more virtues? Let's take a look. And so let's begin our little journey with the cardinal virtues. Before we go any further, let's take a quick step back to look at the main points from last week. We talked about practices and habits and how our normal day-to-day practices can become more entrenched as habits. And these habits become more a part of ourselves and therefore become stable parts of our disposition. And this disposition can be aimed anywhere. So it's important to consider how our habits and practices aim us towards God, where they tend us towards the good so that we can become more like God, to be more Christ-like. And it's these habits that lead us to virtue. Virtues, therefore, are the stable parts of ourselves, formed by our habits, which help us on our journey towards God, loving God and loving our neighbor along the way. So remember that there are different types of virtues, and the focus of today's session will be on the cardinal, sometimes referred to as the human virtues. And there are 4 cardinal virtues: fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence. And so, well, what makes them so cardinal? And how will these 4 guide us on our way towards God? So, the answers to these questions will hopefully be revealed as we go along. The cardinal virtues, or the human virtues, according to the Catechism, are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. We notice immediately firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections. Firm, stable, and habitual. These are not adjectives that refer to things that are flighty or insubstantial. I might even go so far as to say that virtues form the basis of who we are. So it's important for us to be able to form them well within ourselves. They're acquired by our effort, but the possibility to acquire them in the first place comes from the grace of God. They're perfections of the intellect and will. Virtues are not just acts of intellect or disembodied choices, but firm decisions that are made as we live out our lives of faith. We make use of the virtues in our exercise of human freedom, as we seek to make good choices as free children of God. And we also see that we need to make use of our entire selves, all powers of the human being, so that we can become more like God, to be in communion with divine love. And so virtue helps us to be good, loving people. When we look at the cardinal virtues are the fruit and seed of morally good acts. They dispose all the powers of the human being for communion with divine love. We recall how virtues pertain to morally good acts. They're things that we do that allow us to be more loving, to be more in communion with God. After all, good acts are loving acts. And St. Thomas Aquinas very clearly said this too, that the goal of virtues is in its use. As they say, if you don't use it, you lose it. Virtue is something that needs to be exercised, and the more it is exercised, the better one gets at doing it. The more automatic it becomes to us, and the easier it is to actually be virtuous. And so, as we look at this, that's one of us, a good person, a child of God. And so let's see how the various cardinal virtues can actually play out in our actual lives. And so we begin with prudence. It's a human faculty that guides us as we try to discern. God gives us the intellect, and prudence is the right use of the intellect to act for the good out of love to be like God. St. Thomas Aquinas says we need right reason in action. In order to act well, we need to be able to have good reasoning to ground these actions. And we also need to realize that even though prudence is acting from our intellect, it is not overly intellectual, and it should not be confused with timidity. When we act with prudence, we act with sensibility and sensitivity to others. And it's not out of shyness or fear that we are prudent, but we are prudent because it helps us to be able to act well, even though that may mean holding back in some cases. And we also see that prudence is often called a guide to the other virtues because of how we discern and make use of our faculty of the intellect to provide a firm base upon which all the other virtues can proceed. When we think about prudence, I think about the prudent act of wearing a mask in these days. It's prudent because it's for the good of others. We think about the reasons why we do it, and we do it out of the good for others, that it protects ourselves and protects everyone else as well. And even though it's fraught with unneeded connotations or symbolic connections with politics, it makes sense intellectually for us to do this because we know that it helps others. And therefore, our right reason helps us in these right actions. Right actions, that's to do with justice. Justice is the constancy and firmness to act for God and our neighbor. The exercise of the intellect cannot exist on its own. We can discern well, but after that, we have to get down to action. Justice is the virtue of action that flows from prudence. And it's not just about doing many things, but justice involves respecting the rights of each other, to establish human relationships in harmony, and to build these to reflect the love that we have for each other. And justice is related with the justice as being fairness to all whom we meet, that we talk about in the world. Fairness and rightness. These involve also a special concern for those who are most in need of our help. So the examples we have in these times that we live in are acts of kindness that we do for each other, feeding the poor, keeping in touch with loved ones even while sheltering in place. I hear so many examples of people helping others, providing food, getting groceries for people who need uh, groceries brought to them. All these actions flow from prudence, but are exercised in our desire to bring justice into the world. And as we act well, need a little bit of strength and courage to do this. And so Fortitude is to be steadfast and constant. So, as another saying goes, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. That's fortitude. Strength and courage to live the Christian life well, despite the possible trials and tribulations. And while we might not get martyred in the same way that so many of the martyrs did in the past, there's still much room for us to display fortitude in our daily lives. And it begins as we are steadfast in our life of virtue, thinking and acting in accordance with the Lord. And this, when we are strengthened by this, we learn to stand up to external influences, people or the media or just society in general, that may seek to weaken our resolve. We hear in the Psalms, "The Lord is my strength and my song." We are strengthened by the Lord who accompanies us on our way. The final virtue is that of temperance. Temperance is moderation, providing the balance that we need. It's a very important but often neglected virtue. Being in a balance is very important for the spiritual life. St. Ignatius of Loyola referred to this very often in his writings on the spiritual life. St. Thomas and Aquinas and Aristotle emphasized the importance of temperance. The virtue of temperance is about knowing the middle ground between extremes. An example is the previous virtue of fortitude or courage. If we have too much of it, it becomes foolhardiness. If we have too little of it, it becomes cowardice. So fortitude is a temperate form of courage, balanced so that we can act well. And it's also about keeping our instincts and appetites in check. We can sometimes allow these to get the better of us. Temperance helps us to keep ourselves on an even keel on all that we do. And that's very important. Not just to keep ourselves in check, but to aim ourselves towards God. Desire is good, and it has to be for the good of God and our neighbor. And if we think about temperance, we can go back to that first example of wearing masks. Temperance means keeping our righteous anger in check when someone tells us off for having a mask. Knowing that going against them, even though the views may be mistaken, will not do us or them very much good. Instead, we walk away knowing that we are doing the right thing while also keeping everybody safe in the process. As we put things together, we refer to the words of St. Augustine, who says it's all about loving God with one's heart, soul, and effort. We remember how Moses told the people of Israel to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and all our will. And that's what it means to live well. Purity, strength, obedience, and good thinking, these are all faculties given to us that we should seek to develop as we go on in life. And before we end this little session, I'd like to just make a quick note about the relationship between the virtues. The virtues don't act independently. They work together for the good of the person so that we can live well and be like God. And these connections can show us how we can better harness them for our good and the good of others. There are complementary relationships between two pairs, between prudence and temperance, justice and fortitude. As you may have noticed, prudence and temperance are more internal virtues, more to do with the intellect and the will, and they complement each other as we look at how our internal dispositions affect the external acts that we do. And the same with justice and fortitude. These are the more active ones. There's a complementary strengthening and movement to action in either of these. And there are also what we would call contrasting relationships. The example would be how justice and action can sometimes tug us away from our better judgment. And sometimes our passion in wanting to pursue the good may lead us to be less temperate about things. So all these work within the dynamic of ourselves. So is this a problem? Not really, because it's important to recognize that the human virtues need to be developed. And the point of all of them is to get closer to God. And that's where the theological virtues come in, what we're going to be talking about next week. So that helps us to order these human virtues that can sometimes work with and against each other as we seek to come closer to God. So how do we order the human virtues so that we can be more certain that we're heading towards God? Well, I believe the theological virtues give us a way, and that, as a little plug for next week's session, will be talked about in greater detail next week. So we end again with St. Paul to the Corinthians, where he said, "What no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him." We pray for the grace to recognize the virtues within us so that we can be prudent, act justly and with courage, and be temperate to all around us.